Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pants on Fire Exposing Ruling Class Lies. In today's episode, we talk to Amiad from Vietnam about the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is a federal government commission that was created in 1998 with commissioners appointed by the president and leadership from both political parties in the House and the Senate. USCIRF's primary responsibility is to monitor countries around the world for potential violations of religious freedom and make policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. You'll notice a theme with the countries that it deems to be countries of particular concern, and we think this is an interesting conversation and an important conversation, and we hope you enjoy. I've been doing some research because I had never heard of USCIRF until you mentioned it. And
Yeah.
it's weird because like on the surface, the way that they describe themselves, like I'm looking at their website and it's like on the surface, it sounds like a potentially good thing, right? Like it's protecting like religious minorities from persecution. But then I was reading about like the people who are on this committee, and it sounds like it's very Christian in nature.
It has an extreme Christian bias. It's very clearly, a tool of Western chauvinistic, someone called it cultural imperialism, It's also a classic example of the United States claiming to have jurisdiction over every other country in the world.
And that's the part, I think that's the part that people forget, because like it's hard to think outside, at least like for someone who is in the US, it's hard to like think from other people's perspectives and like have empathy and and think about like, well, what if it was reversed and there was like a group coming from Iraq or Iran and they're dictating to us what is okay and what's not okay, like that. We wouldn't like that.
It'd be like, it'd be as if, you could pick a country that the US is unfriendly with or friendly with, it doesn't matter, but, claiming that the US infringed on the freedom of religion of, that, what was that cult in Waco, and, killed all those people because of religious freedom and whatnot. And, it's no one in the US would take something like that seriously. But, the USCIRF was founded in 1998, right? It was the height of this post-Cold War idea of the end of history, US global hegemony. So it was founded with that sort of ego and gall behind it. Where people weren't questioning it. In fact, it was considered a legitimate campaign question. I remember when Clinton was running for office, should the U.S. be the police of the world? And like everyone just accepted that as a legitimate question and not a question baked into chauvinism and imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a list on their website. It's amazing that like I have gone my whole life up until a couple of weeks ago, like never even knowing about it. I do remember something with when Obama was president, like
yeah, so he did, right. But it was specifically, I'm trying to remember, it was specifically aimed at a specific country. I forgot what it was. Aimed at Libya. I think it was, set up as an excuse to criticize another country that the U.S. wanted to target.
Oh, and this says that they revised the language of it so that it was not just applying to countries, but also to people, like just in individuals or groups of people, because they wanted to be able to add ISIS and Boko
Right,
Haram to it.
right, right,
So they made it like actually more broad in scope.
right. And it's interesting also in that criticizing ISIS or Boko Haram, I think we could all agree is the right, is a correct criticism. At the same time, to what end, right? The end game of the commission is to recommend to the State Department to list countries or organizations as states of particular concern, which can then come with sanctions. ISIS doesn't get sanctioned. It's not a country, right? It's not. The whole point was policing other countries, and now they're trying to police organizations. It's kind of expanded into this place of ridiculousness where it's apparent that all it is a tool to create propaganda against US targets, right? It doesn't actually function to protect freedom or of religion or anyone in particular. It just creates propaganda that the US can use to push its agenda.
Yeah. And so it's set up it's set up by or the people who are on this commission are appointed by the president and then leadership from both political parties, from the House and the Senate, and they have 2-year terms. And I think that was new. There weren't clearly defined term limits for these appointees before. And that was
Right.
something maybe from 2011 when Obama re-signed it. But this is interesting. It says that it was supposed to terminate on September 30th, 2011, unless reauthorized or given a temporary extension.
In which case it was reauthorized.
Yeah. So I guess they reauthorized it. Dick Durbin had some amendments to it, and they reauthorized it for a 7-year term, which would have expired in 2018. But it doesn't say what happened after that. Like, why does it even still exist if it was supposed to expire in 2018? I guess it got reauthorized.
It gets reauthorized, right? It's like one of those what do they have, the debt ceiling or whatever, there's just something they set up that they're just going to keep reauthorizing. They have these arbitrary dates where they're like, oh, we have to reconsider things at this point, but it's just an automatic reauthorization. But to go back to what you were talking about, how the different the president, the Senate pro temp, the speaker, they all get to nominate 3 members of the commission. There's no review, right? There's no Senate approval. There's no background check per se. Like, it's just these people get nominated, and you end up with people like Tony Perkins, who is the leader of an actual hate group, a militant Christian hate group, ends up on this commission. And then they want this commission to be taken seriously when he's the head of the Family Research Center. What do they call themselves? A Family Research Council, something like that. Which is listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a anti-LGBT, anti-non-Christian hate group. So he was nominated by Mitch McConnell. Oh, and Tony Perkins, just for the icing on the cake, has connections in his past to the KKK. So it's hard to take seriously, when you look at how it's set up and how it's managed. But again, as you said, what most Americans don't even know about it, right? They just see the end product of propaganda coming out saying, oh, this country or this organization, whatever, doesn't protect religious freedom, and therefore it's our responsibility as Americans to step in and blah, blah, blah. And no one knows how that decision is made, and they just accept it at face value. I think if more people knew that people like Tony Perkins was in on this decision-making process, they would have some more questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, really. I mean, and the countries that they have placed on, so what they call when they designate a country as a country to basically when they put a country on their watch list, it's called a CPC, a country of particular concern. And it's like India, Eritrea, Myanmar, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, Saudi Arabia. It seems really focused. I'm just looking at like their press releases now. It's amazing. But yeah, they're talking about Muslim countries, and then they have a podcast too. The
Yeah.
USCIRF has a podcast. I was listening to some episodes earlier today. They were talking about China and the authoritarian dictatorship of President Xi, and like the persecution of Christians in China. And I think that seems like maybe a conversation for a later episode, but uh, we can talk about it now too if you want.
Yeah, no, and it's well, if you look up the makeup of who the commissions are, the current, if I'm not mistaken, the chair, right? Yeah, the chair, Nuri Turkel, if I'm pronouncing their name correctly, is a lifelong campaigner of, anti-China propaganda. They're the head of the Uyghur American Association, or former head, sorry, of the Uyghur American Association, right? Someone who hasn't lived in China for decades, and has lived in the U.S. and made a career out of telling the world about how China persecutes religious minorities. And this is the person who chairs this commission. So they're taking someone with a very specific agenda and giving them the platform to pursue this agenda.
Yeah, that seems to be the theme with and one thing I noticed with their surveys that they conduct and how they actually gather the data that they're using to make these decisions. They survey quote unquote religious leaders, and so you're not getting the full picture. You're getting you're getting a very specific belief and interpretation of it. Like obviously, if you talk to only Catholic priests, they're going to say, yeah, we're being persecuted.
I think even more so if you only speak to specific Catholic priests, right? If you went to Xinjiang, again, I apologize to anyone that knows how to pronounce that more correctly than I do. And you interviewed the majority of the population and the majority of the clerics, like we see when delegates or groups of investigators from Muslim countries have done, and they go around and they talk to people, they come back with a report saying, okay, no, there's no religious persecution here. But when you pick a few select clerics that happen to, for whatever reason, align with your pre-chosen end, you'll get the information you want. And again, this is once again not presented in the final report to the American people. Oh, this is how we came to this conclusion. They're just saying, okay, we did our research, and China is persecuting people based on religion. And again, the most people would infer, oh, they probably sent investigators, and there's years of research that go into this, and there's probably teams and people on the ground, and there just isn't.
Yeah, I was looking at their one of their more recent posts about Cuba, and I know I'm going all over the place, and we'll get to the
Yeah.
here in a second. But it's fascinating that their report on Cuba says that constitutional protections are there, that the constitutional protections exist for religion and freedom of religion and all that. But then like people that they talk to are saying, yeah, it says that on paper, but it's not enforced. Like it's written down in our constitution, but it's not enforced. So it's just like, well, if you ask like a evangelical Christian, in the South in the US, they're going to tell you that they are being persecuted. They have this kind of like victim mentality.
The war on Christmas.
Yeah, like the non-existent war on Christmas that I don't know, every year when I go to CVS, it seems like the Christmas tree is there sooner and sooner. Like it's there like in mid-October now. but
Right.
to them, they're being persecuted. So if you're only interviewing and surveying religious leaders, and not, and like you said, not even just religious leaders, but like really specific religious leaders, then it's like they're getting the information that they want and they're ignoring any
Exactly.
other information.
Right. So it's not a coincidence that, so they have two lists, right? They have the full-on countries of particular concern list, and then they have the list of warning. Oh, sorry, hold on. My dog is making noises in the background.
No worries.
Um, and then they have the secondary list, right? So it's no wonder that the socialist countries make both lists, right? You have Vietnam, you have China, you have Laos, you have the DPRK, um, you have Cuba. So there's an agenda being pushed, and if you had gone, if you in all these countries, China, Cuba, Vietnam, freedom of religion is enshrined in their constitutions. But yeah, they'll tell people, oh no, it just says that on paper. And again, I think that attitude is based in chauvinism, anti-communism, and imperialistic attitudes, because you never question the freedom of religion that's enshrined in the US Constitution, or even the various European Union countries, who some of them have state religions, right? You have the UK, the head of state is also the head of the church, but no one would question the UK's claim of freedom of religion. But when it's a socialist country, or an Asian country, oh, that's just on paper, and we could dismiss that and ignore that. So again, it's feeding a preconceived notion.
That's a really good point because yeah, like I don't see the UK on their list. And I mean,
Exactly.
really it should be if they're going to be equal across the board and how they determine this, then yeah. Yeah, so
Right.
that yeah, there's no European countries that I see. I mean, they have, let's see, like
Russia,
yeah,
but
Eastern Europe.
that's a
Yeah.
country that it very specifically fits U.S. Agenda.
Yeah. So the whole thing whenever I first started researching it, like it sounds like something that came out of the Cold War, but I was surprised that it didn't exist before 1998. That 1998 is when it was founded.
Right.
But I think you pointed out that that was an interesting time when the Soviet Union had just collapsed a few years prior. And so I don't know. On the one hand, it seems like with that being gone, with the Soviet Union being dissolved, there wouldn't be as much of a need for something like this as there was. And when I say need, I mean like from their perspective, like that was like
Imperialist.
1950s era, like, oh, the Soviet Union is state atheism, and we have to, we added "In God We Trust" to our money in like 1954 as a
Right.
response to this state atheism claim. But 1998, it seems like just an interesting time for them to decide that this is something that the US needs to do.
Well, it aligns with also the time where the U.S. Started to get involved in the dissolution of, or the destruction of, Yugoslavia, right? It was this time where the U.S. really felt they were policing the world, and the world was accepting it. There was no other strong country to respond, right? The USSR was gone. There was no, I hate to use the phrase, but there was no balance of power, right? You had a monopolar world for the first time ever, in the modern era. So the US was able to run amok.
Yeah.
um, and in that, I think that attitude, it starts with the passing of laws like this, where the US claims jurisdiction over all countries in the world. And then that leads to, the US basically bamboozling the world into accepting their invasion of Iraq a few years later, and declaring to the world, these three countries are the axis of evil, and the whole world's either with us or against us, and blah blah blah, right? And it's this whole monopolar attitude that now, with the rise of China, we're starting to see some pushback from. And so I think we're going to see the USCIRF become even more aggressive because it's no longer just taken for granted by the imperialists that, oh, we have this power over the world. There's going to be some pushback. So this is a tool they're using to try and preserve their hegemony.
Well, let's back up a little bit and start with introduction. If you could just tell the listeners who you are and where you
So
are,
yeah,
a little bit about yourself.
so my name is Amiad. I am currently living in Hanoi, Vietnam. I've been here for 10 years. I contribute to the People's World newspaper, often writing about Vietnam. And I also only in the last couple of years found out about the USCIRF because I would read in the news here how the US would place Vietnam on their list of countries of particular concern and why that was problematic. And I looked into it to write articles about it because I've been living here for 10 years. And the idea that there isn't religious freedom here is astounding and clearly not true for anyone that has spent any amount of time here. So I've written a couple articles on it. And just, a couple weeks ago, the US renewed for the West Vietnam's placement on the list of countries of particular concern. So it was a topic of conversation once again here.
What led you to Vietnam? Because I know you're from New York originally, right?
I'm from New York area originally. Yeah, I came to Vietnam. I studied Vietnamese histories in graduate school and during my master's, and I had planned on moving here to study Vietnamese before pursuing a PhD. Life took turns and whatever, and I decided to just move here after suffering personal tragedies to just kind of start my life over. I had friends here, and it's interesting that when I first moved here, I still held a lot of the typical American anti-communist ideas that I had been raised with and never questioned. I had a deep respect for the history and specifically for Ho Chi Minh from my studies, but I just assumed that all socialist ideas died with the USSR and that everything else was just on paper or aesthetics here. And after living here, I realized that wasn't true. And I started to read and research and talk to people. And I saw how Vietnam continued to progress and develop. Whereas, looking back at home in the US, where things were constantly going the opposite direction. And it led me to question everything I thought I knew. And it led me to eventually join the Communist Party USA. And I got involved in a lot of Vietnam solidarity work in the party-to-party relations.
So do you think you'll stay there, like the rest of your life?
I would hope so. I would hope so. I'm currently doing a PhD at the Academy of Journalism and Communication here, which is quite the challenge. But I'm hoping that, I hope my future is here.
Cool. Well, I think that we kind of in our rambling here in the beginning, I think we kind of covered the second item on the list about the background and the history of USCIRF. And so if there's anything else though that you wanted to go into, we discussed kind of how it got started and
Yeah.
who's on it, but if there's anything else we
I
should
I just think we should highlight that it's not just socialists like us that are, or anti-imperialists like us that point out the hypocrisy of the institution, right? It's even some US allies like India has called it a Christian imperialist, cultural imperialist institution that has a pro-Christian slant. Beyond that, I think, again, the countries that aren't on the list are very telling. Like for me, a glaring example is Israel is not on the list. a country that has literal religious laws requiring people to get married within their religion, that says people of, Christians or Muslims are allowed to convert, but Jews aren't allowed to convert. All sorts of like religious laws enforced by the state. And that's nowhere on the list, and nowhere has it even been considered to be investigated by the USCIRF. So yeah, that I think very telling of what the role of this commission is in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, wow. I didn't even think about that, but I mean, yeah, talk about religious persecution. Ask anybody who's living in the Israeli occupied
Right.
Palestine how they
Right.
feel. I mean, yeah, it's amazing, really. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And in my research, I saw a lot about India over the years, India's designations on the list, China, Myanmar, Burma, and now in Vietnam as well. With these designations and these countries that are put on this list, what does it mean for the people of the country? What does it mean for the government? What does it mean for the country in general?
So once a country's been designated as a country of particular concern, it opens them up to sanctions, or at least the threat to sanctions, right? So, for example, with China, it has led to the decision to place sanctions in Russia. Where with Vietnam, it's the threat of sanctions, in my opinion, are used with the hope of trying to get Vietnam to align its foreign policy with U.S. foreign policy, which they always fail. Vietnam has consistently rejected those pushes, but I think that is one of the goals the U.S. has, right? And the U.S. has made it very clear that they would like Vietnam to join this anti-China global coalition that they're trying to build. If you read any of these like Asia Watcher international report things like the Diplomat or whatever, there's always all these articles claiming that, oh, the US is going to build military bases in Vietnam and blah blah blah, and then every year Vietnam reaffirms in its foreign policy that they will join no foreign alliances, they will not join an alliance targeted at any other country, and they will never allow another country to build military bases in Vietnam. So I really believe that the U.S. hopes that these threat of sanctions can be used to pressure Vietnam to bend to its will, but they always fail, and I imagine they always will fail because, again, it goes against the core principles of Vietnamese foreign policy.
Yeah, it almost seems like failing is a good thing in this case.
Yes,
Like you want to be
exactly.
on that list. You want to be on the fail the fail list.
Yeah.
But what it's saying, I'm looking at like from February of this year. I mean, this is like an update to their report about Vietnam specifically, and they referred to the 2018 law on belief and religion, and how that's restrictive in nature and plagued by uneven and inconsistent applications throughout the country. So I don't know if you could speak to like the 2018 law on belief and religion and what that is.
So in the Vietnamese constitution, freedom of religion is protected. I think it's Article 24, Clause 1. Everyone shall enjoy freedom of belief and religion. He or she can follow any religion or follow none. All religions are equal before the law. Line 2, the state respects and protects freedom of religion, belief and religion. And line 3, no one has the right to infringe on the freedom of belief and religion or to take advantage of beliefs and religions to violate the laws. And so there's been laws passed since that clarify that third part. What does that mean? To use religion to take advantage of beliefs and religion to violate the law. So there are cases of cults, just like you see in the US, where people will specifically take advantage of their followers or their flock or whatever you want to call it, and take all their possessions and all their money and whatever. So in cases like that, Vietnamese law allows the government to step in much sooner than the US government would step in, right? The US always seems to step into these things like Waco or whatever in the last second when people are dying and committing suicide and their lives are already ruined. In Vietnam, the government, even though you have the freedom of religion, you cannot use that religion to then go and hurt people. Other cases are when religion is used to as an excuse to attack state security, which again, all countries have this, right? In the US, ISIS would not be allowed to set up a religious organization because that would be, under the guise of religious freedom, because that would be a threat to national security. The same thing in Vietnam. But then the US comes and claims that, despite the enshrinement of religious freedom in the Constitution, because there's these stipulations, therefore it's not real freedom. Right. There was a case that I think it's on the USCIRF's website, actually, a couple weeks ago, maybe it's already a couple of months ago, of this prominent monk, Buddhist monk, who was arrested here. And he was reported in the US as being arrested because of his specific Buddhist beliefs, which didn't, conform to the mainstream. He was arrested because, again, he was holding people against their will in his little cult. He was sexually abusing his followers, and so those were the charges he was arrested from. But the USCIRF and the anti-socialist policy pushers in the State Department took that and said, "Oh, he was arrested because of his religious beliefs." Right, but you can't, just like in the US, you couldn't say, "Oh, my religious freedom allows me to sexually abuse these people." The same thing in Vietnam, except here it's written into the Constitution that that's not allowed. And in the US, that's not. The US Constitution is, as we know, extremely vague and left up to interpretation at the whims of 9 random people that get selected every few years.
Right. Yeah. And yeah. So it's basically like you're not letting this cult hurt people, and so you're persecuting this cult.
Exactly.
In a lot of ways.
Exactly.
It says government persecution continues to be a harsh reality facing unregistered independent religious groups, with many of them being designated as strange, false, or heretical religions.
Right. So the law also requires that religious institutions just register with the government. You fill out some paperwork, you say, okay, this is our religion, these are our properties, this is where we're practicing, whatever. Just, again, so the government can make sure that people's property aren't being taken and their money isn't being taken. And, someone could come and say, "Oh, I'm from some Catholic sect," and try and you can't just claim and set up, "I'm a religion," right?
Right.
And everyone's following me and everything I do is protected because it's freedom of religion, right? You have to go through the proper channels. And that's not a problem, because you have dozens and dozens of, probably hundreds of religions. If you actually went to the different small ethnic minority communities practiced throughout Vietnam, no one has a problem just registering and doing the paperwork. It's the only people that have that problem are people that are trying to break the law and use religion to break the law. Right. The Catholic Church operates openly here. Protestant churches, you have, again, dozens of smaller religions, some local, indigenous religions, others not. One of the religions that's the U.S. has listed as being persecuted because they're not allowed to register is I'm going to pronounce this wrong. I'm sorry. The Falun Gong from China.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Falun, I'm going to pronounce that wrong. I apologize. But again, that is a religion, just not maybe less violent, but not too dissimilar to ISIS, in that it exists for a political goal to topple the government.
Right.
No one would allow someone to institutionalize a religion that's goal is to topple the government in their country. That would not be protected by religious freedom. But when Vietnam acts just like any other country would in that situation, they're considered have not respecting freedom of religion, and again only because that serves the narrative that the U.S. foreign policy wants.
Yeah, because you talk about Christian imperialism, and look at like why is there Vietnamese Baptist Church and a Korean Baptist Church, and like that's
There's
that's red.
mosques, there's I mean, you meet foreigners from all over the world that come and travel here. In fact, the government does everything they can to encourage people to come and be tourists here, and you don't have to tell anyone what religion you are. You don't have to tell them what you're practicing. You don't have to do anything. If you want to come for religious reasons, you have to register. If you want to come to proselytize, you have to register. And you might be told no, because not everyone wants, people coming and proselytizing could be used to take advantage, right? It depends who you are, what you're doing. But I know that Chabad, right? They're a Jewish organization. They exist here, and they don't proselytize to non-Jews, but they do try and encourage secular Jews to become religious, and they openly operate here, right? So it's not this blanket idea of people can't. I mean, Catholics, again, the Catholic Church is huge here. 8% of the population is Catholic. Catholics proselytize all the time. So when someone is not allowed to come here to proselytize, it's because for whatever reason, they haven't proven that they're not a risk to the people they're going to be proselytizing to. So if you're coming for legitimate reasons and you're not going to hurt anyone, there is no reason to think that you would be persecuted for your religious beliefs. It is only those that want to take advantage and hurt people that or hurt the government that would be stopped. And again, every government has the right to protect itself.
Right. And it's funny, like this idea of like unregistered versus registered religious groups. In the US, it's the same thing. Like if you want to get that tax exemption as a official religion, you're
That's true.
registered.
Actually, I didn't think about that. I didn't think about that. It was funny because I was talking about this subject on the news here, and they asked if the U.S. has to register religions, and I said not that I was aware of, but I didn't think about it because in the U.S. everything goes through the tax authorities, right? The IRS is the world's largest police organization, after all, and I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, I mean, and we're seeing like some organizations like the Satanic Temple that are kind of throwing that back in the face of the government by saying they'll go to like these little small towns that are trying to put 10 commandment monuments up, and they'll say, okay, well, if you are going to do that, you have to let us put a Baphomet statue on the courthouse lawn. And they usually take the 10 commandment thing down because they don't want that. But it's like, okay, if you want to have freedom of religion, then that means we can do what we want to do, and we can practice our religion.
That's interesting. I know there's also a Jewish organization in Florida that's claiming the new anti-abortion laws are infringing on their freedom of religion because there are cases under Jewish law where an abortion would be required, again, to save the life of the mother. And under Florida law, that would not be allowed.
So I guess like regarding the getting put on this list, it seems to me like you may have hit the nail on the head when you said that there's a goal of kind of building alliances against China, and that it may have not much to do with religion as much as it has to do with political alliance building under the threat of sanctions, which are a form of violence. I mean, it can absolutely cripple a country's economy.
Not only are sanctions a form of violence, they're also against the Geneva Convention and a human rights violation. They're, for collective punishment and targeting civilians. So, yeah.
So
we should also remember that Vietnam was a country that lived under U.S. embargo from 1973, or no, I think the embargo started in 75, and it lasted until 95 or 96, right? So, yeah, I mean, Vietnam knows all too well the harshness of living under U.S. sanctions, and it's an incredible tool of U.S. imperialist power, but again, a human rights crime at the same time.
So what are the if there are any, what are the requirements that the USCIRF is trying to impose on Vietnam? Like what would it take for Vietnam to get removed from this list?
I would imagine they would like, I think if Vietnam, within the realm of religion, were to allow, these anti-socialist religious cults like that Chinese one that I cannot remember their name, or cannot pronounce their name, sorry, to set up, to institutionalize here, that would be a step forward. So in other words, if they allowed organizations to come and try and topple the government, or organize to topple the government, that would be a step forward in the US eyes. So I think that would be something that the State Department would like to happen. That's never going to happen. And I also do believe, I don't have evidence for this, it's just it seems the way US-Vietnam relations have been going, that the US very much wants Vietnam to enter this anti-China alliance that they're trying to build, and encircling China with on all sides, and Vietnam is just not going to do that. Again, it goes against the four core no principles of Vietnamese foreign policy. China is also Vietnam's biggest trading partner. The two communist parties have very good relations. It's just not going to happen, but the US very much wants it to. So I think it would take something drastic like that to get them to drop Vietnam from this list of nations of particular concern, countries of particular concern.
Yeah, I mean, in this, like they do make recommendations. There's recommendations to the US government, obviously, to place the country on the list, and then encourage the Vietnamese government to amend the law on belief and religion to conform to international standards. Encourage the effort by central, provincial, and local authorities to resettle Hmong Christians, HMONG, Hmong Christians in subdivision 179. That seems very specific.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that is. Hmong is an ethnic group here. They're one of the largest minority ethnic groups.
Yeah, I see what you mean. This does seem like it's
a very specific case. I'm not aware of what that specific case would be.
Yeah, so the recommendation for Congress is to send delegations focused on religious freedom and related human rights to Vietnam, and specifically request to visit areas impacted by freedom restrictions.
It's interesting though, because the Hmong regions, one of the biggest Hmong regions is in the area of Sapa in the northwest. It's one of the biggest tourist sites in Vietnam. Not exactly sure what's stopping anyone from visiting there. There's hotels every 3 feet if you really want.
So this really does seem like it is based in imperialism and propaganda, and yeah, I think you're right about the alliance against China. I'm sure the US doesn't like that Vietnam has a socialist government, and we've seen Laos is on the list, Cuba's on the list. I mean, it is really telling, which is why I was saying, like, it almost seems like this was something that came out of the 1950s, right, as opposed to the 90s.
Right. In other leftist countries, like Algeria, now I don't know much about religious practice in Algeria, but Syria, Syria I know has they have a large Christian minority. They have Sunni and Shia Muslims. They have Alawi Muslims. They have a very small Jewish minority. I don't know too much about life there, so I don't want to speak with any authority. But again, it's a left-leaning government. And it's interesting, I came across something when I was getting ready for this podcast specifically about Laos. There was an argument between US officials on whether to include Laos or not. And they, for whatever reason, decided to. But clearly the evidence isn't overwhelming, even in their tainted imperialistic way of pushing things. But they still made sure that all the socialist countries were either full on designated as countries of particular concern or on the watch list to be designated countries of particular concern.
Hmm. So what can we do as communists in the United States, as socialists and workers and leftists, like just spread the word, I guess, and educate people about this?
I think that's a big step. Again, as you said at the start, I mean, you weren't aware that this institution even existed, right? Um, if more Americans were aware that their tax dollars were going to yet another ridiculous tool of imperialism that has zero effect on their life, employing people like Tony Perkins and other what was his name, Gary Bauer, who also was from the Family Research Council, right? I mean, legitimate members of hate groups and leaders of hate groups. I think Americans would open their mind to, or open their eyes to, the lies that they've been fed about these other countries and what the U.S. is doing on the international front, right? And so many Americans continue to believe this idea that the U.S. is this force for good in the world and only goes to war for freedom, democracy, liberty, and blah, 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 all these abstract ideas. But when you actually look at the details of how the U.S. interacts with other countries and and how they act differently with different countries, it becomes very clear that there is a imperialist agenda that not only hurts everyone overseas, it also hurts Americans at home themselves, right? Because again, it's a waste of resources, and it creates enemies where there doesn't need to be enemies. Vietnam very much wants to live in peaceful coexistence with all countries. It's again another core tenet of their foreign policy. We see that even though the U.S. had committed decades worth of war crimes against Vietnam, the U.S. And Vietnam continue to improve relations. Vietnam continues to trade with the U.S. and do everything they can to have a good relationship with the U.S., despite, again, being designated a country of particular concern, despite the U.S. not having done enough to help the victims of Agent Orange and all these other things. But the U.S. again tries to create enemies and tries to have that whole them versus us attitude with foreign policy, and that only comes back to hurt Americans, citizens at home. So I think if we can educate more people, there could be some organized pushback. It's like what was it called? The House Committee on Un-American Activities, right? I know technically it still somewhat exists under a different name, but it's lost all its power. We could do something similar with this. The USCIRF should not exist, and if it does continue to exist, it should lose all power.
I think that's great. I think that would be, to expose it, which is what we're doing right now, having these discussions and exposing it for what it truly is.
Right.
And people would start to recognize it's just a kind of a bureaucratic waste of taxpayer dollars. But like the right doesn't care about that when it comes to international and foreign affairs. Like they only care about it domestically. Like, they only worry about our tax dollars when it's going to help like poor people in the United States. But when it comes to anything that's happening overseas, they are all in for it.
Actually, it's in some ways that makes the USCIRF scarier under a Democratic administration, right? Because when the Republicans are picking people like Tony Perkins and Gary Bauer, it's obvious, okay, this is a ridiculous joke of an institution, right? When the Democrats fill the seats of the commissioners with people that have better looking resumes, let's say, it and the Democrats, they've also leaned more and more into imperialism and protecting U.S. hegemony around the world. The USCRF actually, in some ways, becomes much scarier under a Democratic administration. So I think now is the time to be extra vigilant and speak even, louder and work harder to expose the USCIRF for what it is. And it's important, and we have to build a broad coalition. It's not just the socialist countries that are being attacked. As we said, it's the fact that countries like Israel aren't being listed in that list, and so it's the Palestinians in that case that are being attacked, or Morocco. There's another example, right? That doesn't they suppress the Sahrawi people and other minorities. There's lots of examples around the world that if it doesn't fit the U.S. specific imperialist agenda, they don't get added to this list, right? So I think now is an important time to make people aware. It's something to protest. It's something to dismiss. When you read in the news that a country has been designated, when a country like Vietnam has been designated a country of particular concern, don't take that at face value. Do your own research. Come visit Vietnam. It's a great place to visit, and you can travel to the Hmong areas. You can visit churches. You can see, just last week, Christmas Eve, Hanoi, which is not a majority Christian city by any stretch of the imagination, everyone comes to the churches and stands outside and watches the Christians, and pray and light up the lights and do the nativity scenes and sing songs together. And it's a great, there's a lot of intercultural sharing and freedom of religion here. And so come see for yourself the way that the U.S. basically just lies about the situation here.
Amiad, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies. This podcast is produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.